Hey podcast, welcome back to another episode. Now I think you'll really enjoy today's episode. Now today we've got Dr. Gareth Jones on, who's a coach at ALine Coaching. So he's a mountain bike coach, and I'm going to read this so I get it absolutely spot on. He also has a PhD in behavioral health psychology and sports and exercise psychology. So to break that down into a nutshell is he knows absolutely tons about improving your riding, both from a skills point of view, but also from a mental point of view. So I hope you really enjoy the listen. We'll get straight into it. Thank you. Gaz, thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, no
My
worries.
first question might be completely off here, so just tell me if I'm wrong. But am I right in thinking that you spend time in New Zealand as well as Sheffield?
I don't personally, unfortunately. The guy who started ALine mountain bike coaching, John, he lives out there. And so he was running ALine for a number of years, kind of helped set it up and, actually created it and so on. And then we started working together, and then he moved out to New Zealand and I took over ALine UK. So we now have like a sort of joint venture where he does stuff out in New Zealand and I do stuff in the UK. So yeah, unfortunately it's not quite as glamorous as I get to go out to New Zealand a couple of times a year or throughout the winter or so on. But yeah, it's I look after the UK side.
Okay, so do a lot of your customers go out there to ride then and vice versa, or are they kind of...
They've got a point of contact. So there has been people that we've known that have kind of been out to New Zealand, not necessarily because of ALine, but because of, it's a pretty nice mountain biking destination and so on. So they've gone out and they've used, spoken with John about, where to ride or whatever, or they've met up and done guided rides or whatever. But yeah, we're not like a holiday company in that side of things, but just happen to be in New Zealand and in Sheffield, UK.
So you've just partnered up with Ben, haven't you, who we had on the podcast about 2 months ago?
Yeah.
And now ALine is kind of, you're not necessarily going separate, are you? But you're both focusing on different specialities, is that right?
Yeah. So we both basically came to a realization that we wanted to grow our respective companies. So me being ALine and Ben being WeRide, and that it was hard to do that on your own sort of thing. And to grow the company, you obviously need more people, like having more resource would help. But the problem with that is finding the right person. And it's really difficult because typically the right person is probably already started another coaching company or so on. So Ben at WeRide, we were kind of ALine and so on. So there are various things that kind of put us together. Like we knew each other previously, like obviously both operating in around similar sorts of areas, both in coaching. We kind of had a WhatsApp group between a few of us coaches sort of thing, just to, triangulate, coordination so we don't like run into each other or like aim, like plan to use the same part of the trail at the same day, that sort of stuff.
Got you.
So we'd known about it and been in conversation for a long time. And then we decided for various reasons just to have a conversation. So we kind of met down at a coffee shop not far away and just kind of put an idea to Ben, basically just saying, what do you think about kind of joining forces a little bit? And I didn't go into that meeting like knowing what that would look like, but we were both open to the idea, and through conversation we kind of came up with a bit of a plan. So ALine now is the coaching arm. Yeah. So we are the kind of deliver all the coaching, and WeRide, Ben did coaching and guiding. And so now WeRide is becoming like the guiding side of things.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So it complements really well.
Yeah.
So both brands still exist and both companies still exist, but a bit more tailored, a bit more specific.
Okay. And I bet a lot of people end up going to the other one without necessarily wanting that initially. So you might sign up to do some guided riding in the peaks, find out you're struggling on that, and then he sends you over to you.
Yeah, definitely. And Ben, both of us deliver coaching. So both of us do coaching under ALine. But I don't have any guiding qualifications or like specifically. So Ben looks after the guiding, and he'd done that before, like up in the Lake District and a bit of Scotland and so on. So kind of just joined forces, and sometimes it's just nice having another colleague, so to speak, kind of jump ideas between or bounce ideas off each other and so on. And so that was another big advantage of it. Like, and also when everything kind of is weighted on one person's shoulders, if you're for whatever reason poorly or whatever, you'd normally have to cancel that session. And a huge thing for me and for ALine is the client kind of experience with ALine. And nobody wants a cancelled session. So actually having two of us, it allows for any sort of kind of fine tunement of, if someone's poorly, could someone else cover that session? So we've just got another opportunity then to kind of make sure that the client experience is really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what, do you get a whole range of types of people who end up coaching? Because I think, I could be totally wrong here, but I imagine that I think every mountain biker would benefit from coaching. But I bet if you were to stop people at Bike Park Wales and ask if you've been coached before, I imagine that a tiny percentage will have actually done coaching. Would you agree?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So like the culture in mountain biking hasn't necessarily been sort of pro coaching in a way. Coaching, for whatever reason, has sometimes had a bit of a stigma around it, that it's for beginners, or it's for early, you only need that if you've got a kind of a problem sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you just need to fix that problem, as opposed to actually it being about performance enhancement. And I'd say probably before I even started coaching sort of 8-9 years ago, that was slowly changing. But as with any coacher, it doesn't happen overnight, and it takes a bit of time. So yeah, I'd say it's becoming more and more acceptable to kind of have coaching and kind of be, said you've been or received some form of coaching.
Yeah.
And I'd say that is representative in our client base as well. It has become less and less, it's about fixing a problem, as opposed to it's also about, I just want to get better, or I want to, I know I can jump, but I don't know how to get better at jumping, or that sort of thing. So it's not just about fixing a problem; it's also about performance enhancement.
Okay.
So that, we get more racers now, for example, saying, "Oh, I'm attending a race at," really common ones like Hard Rock or Ardmores, and it's no longer a conversation of I want to go there and just want to be able to get round, or I don't want to injure myself, or these kind of like negative kind of connotations. It's more around, or more often it's about, I got 20th place last year or 30th place. How do I get 25th? 25th or like 15th or 10th, or improve your performance that way. So yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because in any other sport, if you look at football, for example, like we were talking about before, every footballer has a team of coaches, and they have a team of coaches for every area, don't they? So like nutrition and physio and PTs, and obviously the actual skill side of it, because I think it's beneficial to have somebody watching you and tweaking. I've seen myself a few times when Zach will be recording me, and then you watch something back and they're like, I thought my chest was way lower. Like, you're going down the descent and you kind of drop your chest a bit, and in your head you think that you drop your chest to the bars, and then you look and you've like barely bent them. Same thing for like, say, manual, and you like do a manual, and in your head your bum is nearly touching the rear wheel, and then you watch it and you're nowhere near where you think you are.
So we talk about that loads, is like the feedback loop. So it's like really common, like and I do this myself, I'm not bashing it at all, but like, watch a YouTube video on it. But the problem with that is, one, it's disconnected in time, but two, it's disconnected in that the information is only going one way. So it's coming from the person who's created the video to the recipient, and then they're perhaps gone away having some dinner, or it might even be the next day they think about implementing that. And there's no like feedback loop there to say, oh, actually, we're not quite doing what you think you're doing, and here's a video. I'll take that video, and actually, it's not just about you need to get your chest low, but we often talk about like the mechanics, like how do you do that, why do you do that, and so on. So it's about, for me, a lot of the time, it's about building that whole picture. For me, I personally think very sort of holistically. I have to know why, I have to know how, all these kind of more finer details. And I think that's really, really important to kind of emphasize and get across. And I think having a coach helps give you that feedback loop.
Yeah, of course. So what kind of, when people come to you and they say, I want to go from 30th at Hard Rock to 20th, or from 500th to 400th, how do you figure out what they need to do to break forward that time? Speaking of the post,
I told you it would come. I told you. Bang on time, aren't they? Yeah.
So how do you know, if somebody comes to you as a rider and they say they want to get better?
Yeah.
How do you know where to start if they're not telling you, I need to improve X?
Yeah, I mean, even when they say that they need to improve X, not that you don't, you take it on board, of course you do, because it's a piece of information. But you take it with a slight pinch of salt, because really it's about like that quality of data. First of all, it's about understanding and kind of knowing exactly, trying to gather as much data as you can, really, before you kind of assimilate a kind of a strong plan, if you will. It depends on what the client really wants. So some, like I work with clients like routinely for weeks, months, years. Some it's kind of like they just join like the odd course like once a year or a couple times a year. Some people it's like a bit more sporadic. You kind of have huge kind of mixture in between. But it's really about trying to get as much of a broad picture and as much data as you can from that person to really kind of assimilate, well, what do they want to achieve? What is their kind of limiting factors, and kind of similar to the fitness industry, really saying, well, we need to figure out where you are right now, actually, and kind of go from there. So what that looks like in reality, again, it's different for everyone. We're very client-based, or kind of client-centered, sorry. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all kind of ethos. It's all about working with the clients and so on. But it could be come on a course, because we can quickly support you in quite a broad sense on a course, and we always watch quite intently like what riders are doing and so on, and then from there, if somebody would like to kind of continue working, continue progressing on it, like they like what they've heard and so on, we then come up with more tailored programs. So that can be like through private tuition and all that sort of gubbins, really. But yeah, it's quite, we need to see the rider ride, because often riders talk in outcomes and symptoms. So they talk about like, I can't jump, or I don't know how to go further in a jump. So they're talking about outcomes there.
Okay.
I can do that jump, but I can't do that jump. So a really common one, we're in Sheffield and it is up at Grenoside Wood, for example. I can do those tabletops, but I can't do X or Y, or I can't do some of the gap jumps, for example. For instance, in my head, if they're doing the tabletops, but they're not doing the gap jumps, perhaps that's more psychological.
Yeah.
So therefore, the planner might be thinking about creating, it's about actually supporting that psychology and building up that kind of more evidence-based approaches and so on to support their psychology, to think that as they kind of progress, that they're also thinking about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and building up that evidence base so that they build their confidence and so on. Or it might be a more technique focused type thing. So it really just depends on kind of getting that data and getting as much data as you can, and really going out for a ride with someone, whether that's on course or private or whatever that might be. Because it can be so many different things. So like one thing you'll often hear me talk about in coaching is I talk about limiting factors. And we don't mean that in a negative sense. Everybody's got them. Me, you, Steve, Pete. All of us. Every rider's got them. And it's normally those, and the things that really stand out to clients on a coaching day are the things that we've talked about that address their limiting factor.
Okay.
Because that's the thing where it's like that will make the biggest difference on their performance today. But then as they typically work on that, it's not to say that the other stuff we covered isn't important. It 100% is. It just hasn't necessarily addressed their limiting factor.
Yeah.
And as they then start to work on that, that kind of really stands out to them. They get less of a return on that. And then all of a sudden something else is their limiting factor.
Got you.
So when somebody says, I'm struggling with jumping or drops or corners, or, like another really common one is front wheel washouts or whatever.
Yeah.
There can be 7 or 8 different reasons as to why that's happening. So we need to get as much data as we can to understand why. Is it a body mechanics thing? Is it a braking thing?
Yeah.
It can be all sorts of things. Is it even like a bike setup thing? It's very rare we kind of really give a kind of hard advice on bike setup, but if it's really obviously wrong, then we can support on that.
That makes sense. So when you say limiting factor, how do you define that? Does that just mean a weakness or not?
I try not to use that word too much, like improvement areas or where's the greatest area for growth and so on. But yeah, essentially sort of, I was just trying to think now, like a really common one on the kind of lower end of the spectrum for riders is core strength.
Okay.
And if a rider like has a weaker core strength, what you tend to find is as they go through certain ranges of motion, as they go through certain movements and so on, their hips like rotate underwards, under.
Yeah.
So in other words, as their hips rotate under, their chest opens up, so it gets more kind of vertical, if you will, and their legs kind of push forward. So they're using their quads more, and they're kind of the distribution of their body mass is over a smaller point. And what that then creates is like a symptom of that poor body mechanics or less desirable body mechanics, is you then get this sort of pendulum effect of that body mass moving between the front and rear tyre. And that's where you get unpredictability in how the bike feels, and how the suspension works, and how the tyres work, and all that sort of stuff. So we'd be first looking to address that before we start to think about elbows and other types of things. So it's really, what is they've got an outcome, we've got an aim. What's the real kind of linchpin to what is preventing that person from doing that? And there's normally more than one. There often are. You've got to mountain biking. I often describe it's not cycling. It's really, really dynamic. It's very specific, and there's so many things going on. Like people, I think, often try to simplify it, but actually it's very complex. We can then come up with strategic and simplified kind of solutions so it doesn't overwhelm me. But it is a complex sport, and so there's often more than one reason as to why somebody's doing something that's less desirable or not.
So you said that a really common one that people have there is a weak core, and you can see it as a coach. How would somebody, if they didn't get a coach, how would somebody know that they had a weak core and it was affecting the riding?
Okay, so we're talking about the coach's eye there, I guess, a little bit. So when we go and we're watching riders and so on, one of the things I'm looking for when a rider does this, for example, or has this symptom very specifically, is they will, as they come into a feature, so say they understand roughly a good body position.
Yeah.
And so they're in a relatively good, what I call a ready position.
Yeah.
As you kind of come down a trail in a good ready position, as they come into features, so that could be, any sort of significant feature on a trail, whether that's a rock garden or a corner or whatever that might be, that feature causes that symptom. So as they come through a corner, for example, you notice their body stand more upright and their hips tuck closer, like get further in the middle of the bike, as opposed to keeping nice and strong and stable between your two wheels, essentially. So that's how we'd normally understand it. So if you were a rider without a coach, I'd suggest getting some friends to film you.
Okay.
That's some of the best feedback, because as you mentioned earlier on, sometimes you think you're doing something, but you're not always. And video feedback is such a great way. And I encourage all my clients to do that. So one of the big take homes that are, one of the big sort of ending sentences at the end of any coaching day is, any coaching day is a big bit of knowledge transfer. And one of the things I always tell clients is that I'm trying to support them to be the coaches at the end of the day. So my language changes during the day. So at the start, it's very instructional and so on. But by the end of the day, I'm more asking questions for them to tell me what they think. So like self-diagnose, essentially. And by doing that, not only am I able to hear that they have learned, because they're starting to diagnose why and what from what we've kind of talked about in the day, but then also they're showing understanding, and they're showing actually, when I'm no longer here, as in like the next day, if they go out riding next week or whatever that might be, they can take a video and they can start to understand why it is that the symptom or the outcome that they've got is occurring. They can start to address it. Yeah. So expectations is something we always talk about in ALine, and I talk about a lot. And not all people, like I obviously don't want to speak for everyone, but a lot of people's expectations don't necessarily match their overall like plan. Yeah. So like what they want to achieve, like I really want to achieve jumping is like a really common one. I really want to get better at jumping. I was like, okay, so how often do you go out practicing jumps? I don't. Okay, so maybe that's part of. So how do you expect to get better at jumping? Yeah. I mean, I don't mean that in like a
no.
But it's like sometimes people, it's like often around avoidance. People avoid thing that they
things they're
feel
not very
nervous
good at.
about, or things they're not as good at. And that's not necessarily a problem, but it doesn't make you a well-rounded rider. So when I look at any rider, I try to support them to be. Have you ever used like performance wheels or anything like that?
No, I've
so
not
like,
heard of that.
You imagine like a pie chart.
Yeah.
Divide it into as many pieces as you need to. That's your performance, what makes up performance.
Okay.
And then rate yourself on like 1 to 10, basically, on all of those different areas.
Yeah.
One of the common issues and where people find they've got a problem is where, and this is all relative to the person, so the number's arbitrary really, but it's good for you to know your own sort of numbers and so on. So if you rated yourself at a 5 for most things of riding, your trail speed will naturally be at a relative 5 out of 10 for you, yeah?
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden you'll come to say jumping, just as an example, and that'll be a 2 out of 5. But you're going trail speed, that's a 5 out of 5.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, that's where you start to cause issues. So when we work with riders, and especially over the long term, we really try to round that profile out as much as possible to minimize risk and so on, so that everything is that 5. So as they come across jumps or drops and steep sections, routes, whatever, they're going the right trail speed for whatever they're kind of doing. And then we slowly expand that all quite consistently and together over time.
Okay. So what are some of those areas then? So am I right in thinking the performance wheel, the spokes and the numbers? Yeah, I have seen it. I do know what you mean.
Yeah.
So you've got, would jumping be one of those, trail speed? Or is it different? There isn't a set one, is there not?
There are typical ones.
Yeah.
But we tend to, it depends how you're working with the client, to be honest. The more bespoke your work, or the more, the closer you're working with the client, the more detailed you can go with this. But I think it's important to use the client's language. So they kind of come up with their own kind of definitions of lots of things. But then there's also, you could have your own, depending on the client, again, some of them like to think really broad picture. So they don't necessarily want a separate nutrition, skills, performance, fitness base, a performance wheel for each. They just might want a general one. Yeah. Some people are really granular and really detailed, and therefore they do want a kind of a separate kind of performance wheel for each one of those things. So you could then, I don't know much about nutrition personally, but you could then go into like within the nutrition, it'd be like macro and all the different like nutritional values and so on. And then it could be within skills, you could look at all the different skills that you kind of typically cover, like jumping, drops and so on. But then some people then have a very specific area that they want to work on. So then it would be a really specific kind of identified spoke in their performance wheel, for example. So like off-camber left-handers. If they're noticing they constantly crash on off-camber left-handers, that might make up a tailored kind of spoke up to that performance wheel sort of thing. So, but you think in broad terms, it's roughly define what you think kind of makes up performance, as detailed or as broad as you like, and then kind of go from there really. And as I said, the number's arbitrary. It's just a kind of stick in the ground to say, I think I'm roughly here.
Okay, got you.
And it's important to note these fluctuate with time. So I had an injury last year. My fitness performance wheel went down massively because I just, I couldn't. I was sitting on a couch, couldn't get fitter. Yeah. And even some of my skills-based stuff, is definitely down, and I'm slowly kind of building that back up, sort of thing. But I think it's good to know kind of how to build up and kind of where to put your energy and so on. Another way this manifests itself is, so I often talk to riders about like variety is the spice of life. I think that's quite a common sort of saying, isn't it? Yeah. But I kind of really believe it within mountain biking. And I think myself included, especially since lockdown, where we've kind of got used to our local trails and so on. Yeah. We tend to keep riding the same stuff again and again and again. Yeah. And then you go for some of your listeners, I'm sure kind of race and so on. You go to a race and you're like, oh, I've never ridden even like soil like this or ground like this, or you can go to all different, and your tires react hugely different, and all of a sudden the setup that you think works amazingly no longer works, or doesn't work quite as well as you'd like. Yeah. So I'd often encourage people to ride lots of different locations and so on, and then it highlights So this is like a really common one. I keep going back to jump, sorry. But like people said, oh, I'm really good at my local jump. So this is like a common email I'd get. I'm really good at jumping here and here. I went to, I don't know, someone that's got a bit more progressive jumps like Revolution used to, or Dovey or Bike Park Wales, all of these like different trails. And they're like, oh, I can't ride though. I don't know how to jump there.
Yeah.
Some of it would be psychological and so on, but sometimes it's also, and I don't know if you've ever spoken to like a trail builder before. I think that'd be a really interesting one, but they all have a slight kind of flavor of how they build a jump, for example. So their lips will typically be quite similar. If you only ever ride jumps in one area, you'll get very used to that style of lip. Yeah. And then if you kind of constantly widen and broaden that spectrum of experience base and riding lots of different locations, you'll get much better at riding lots of different types of lip and so on.
The biggest thing that improved my riding in the last, say, 5 years. So I used to live. It's only about 10 miles away from each other, but I used to live in Saddleworth, for anybody who's local. A lot of people aren't. So there, the majority of the riding I did was bridle way. It was like wide open, not many corners, fast. Like, you could easily do 30 mile an hour, but there wouldn't be that many corners. And then I went riding for the first time when I moved into our new house 4 years ago, something like that. And he took me to the local woods. Now that was steep, muddy, off camber. I literally spent the whole time on my bum. Like I was either like, some of the bits I'd attempt, but I was that nervous on it that I was just slamming on the brakes and over the back wheel. Now, you know how that goes on a steep descent. So the front wheel was just flipping and I was off. The rest of the time I just slid down. So like that, I was like, what am I doing? It was the middle of winter, like deep mud, so steep. I was like, how does anybody ride this? But I could see that they did because he did in front of me. And from that point, I kind of made an effort to go back to the trails. I picked that absolute easiest trail that we rode. And then I just started sectioning parts of it. So I couldn't do the whole trail. But I was like, right, these top two corners, like the first trail he took us to, it was kind of like a steep turn through the woods. And then there were these massive boulders you had to get through. And the only way you did it is literally like stopping, flicking your back wheel around, flipping your back wheel the other way and then going round. So I spent, I think, 2 hours just practicing on that section. And then after 2 hours, I went from not being able to do it at all to being able to get through it comfortably with speed. And then I'd work on the next section and the next section. And for me personally, at the time, I'd never ridden anything that was even close to that steep. So there's one section which is just a load of really steep berms. And then the type of trails you can't stop on. Like when you're in, you have to ride to the bottom. Like you cannot stop. But a lot of it for me was just, I'd spend time practicing a couple of corners, but just being in the steep environment made me not nervous of it anymore because I'd be there for 2 hours. I didn't even notice at the time that's what was happening. But when I arrived, I was really nervous. And then all of a sudden, it wouldn't look as steep. And it's really weird because now if I go back to some trails that 4 years ago used to be unrideably steep in my head back over Saddleworth Way, I look at them and think, I could do that like one-handed and closing one eye. Like it just doesn't look steep, but it literally changes your perception of it. But for me, what you were talking about riding different trails, it was to start off with trying to do all of the trails with him was way beyond my comfort zone. It was too much. Like I just spent my whole time sliding down the side of the hill, but then going back and building up bit by bit by bit really helps. And now I can ride all of the trails that, he showed me and I feel comfortably. And now I actually enjoy it. So now I go back and I ride the old trails. I just find them so boring now. Like I realized I could have been doing this on a hardtail the whole time. Like it's just not challenging. So yeah, I totally agree in the riding different trails. There was, you heard of the Ride Companion podcast? Yeah. So I was listening to one of those the other day. I forget his name. He's an enduro rider. Dan Wolf, is that right? Irish guy?
Yeah.
So he was on the other day and they asked him a question around what does somebody need to be a good enduro racer? And I didn't know where I was going to go with it. But the first thing he said is that they need to be great at riding different trails. So he says whenever he goes on a ride, he doesn't ride the same trail twice. He always rides different trails, which I found was interesting because when I'm trying to get faster, I'll ride the same trail on a ride 5 times. And I can appreciate why that's beneficial because you're hitting the same corner over and over and over again. It does improve your skills. But I thought it was interesting that he just goes out and rides every trail differently throughout a ride.
Yeah, and it's different horses for courses, I think. We do a lot of, obviously, working with clients and so on. I think it needs to I generally stay away from absolutes, like always.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's you're always if you use an always like an absolute like that, you're going to limit something.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to be doing something else. So for example, some underlying philosophies and principles at ALine is we have skills. So that's what most people book onto coaching for, or what they think they kind of book onto coaching for, or kind of what they want to get out of it and so on. And then psychology and methodology. So they're like our 3 pillars, if you will. So everything we do is based on those kind of works on those 3 pillars. And how they work together is if you're trying to achieve a skill, so like an outcome, like I want to get better at jumps or riding steeps in your example there. If you just go out there and don't adopt an appropriate methodology for what you're looking to achieve. So in other words, like your example of I went out with this chap, this kind of guy you're riding with, and if you couldn't do full runs doing all that on the first day, that was an inappropriate methodology to try to ride that trail in full runs all day from the off.
Yeah.
And if you don't adopt the right methodology, your psychology will be will suffer.
Yeah.
In that
I was scared to go back to those trails after that first time.
Exactly. Because our brains are there in part to help us survive and to protect us and to seek good experiences, and sometimes we need to challenge ourselves. Yes, that's good, but there's a difference between challenge and threat, and the brain's quite likes to know the kind of difference in that. Like we like to expand and challenge ourselves, but we don't want to threaten ourselves, i.e. put ourselves in harm's way for no apparent sort of reason, sort of thing.
So the brain likes to be challenged.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, that's a big part of your kind of dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, sort of that whole chemical production sort of systems in your brain are there to reward you as you learn. That's a big part of what our brains are there to do, is to help us to learn, to store information, to then progress on to the next thing, sort of thing. And we get a dopamine hit when we learn. So doing something new, challenging something is really good. But if we threaten ourselves, i.e. the current level we're at is well below the ask of the trail, for example, it's very difficult. It's very rare that you'd get something really positive come out of that. Sometimes you do, like a bit of awareness and so on, but in general, it is kind of difficult. So you've kind of got to match your challenge to kind of where you're at kind of at the time. So everything's kind of based on those 3 things. So if you adopt the right methodology, you're generally you're more likely to then adopt the right psychology, i.e. I can do this. I'm looking forward to this. I'm not, it may be, getting a bit of butterflies, but I'm not absolutely petrified. Yeah. And that you're therefore more likely to adopt the right skills. Yeah. Because and we've probably, I've been here myself as well. And so sometimes we go that bit beyond our comfort zone and a bit beyond our limit, if you will. And instantly the brain starts to tell us to cramp up, essentially. So you often, like, a really common example of this is like the elbows drop. Yeah. And if you've been on on an ALine course before, you'll know I talk a lot about breathing. And when I'm asking clients to do certain things, even like in what we call a bike gym, which is essentially like a car park space, when they're really concentrating, you'll find they stop breathing. Breath. They hold their breath. Yeah. And what does that do? It tenses the muscles. And all of a sudden, you're not riding as fluid. So like if I'm ever feeling nervous or whatever, and I really encourage this with clients, and we work a lot with clients on this, is about sometimes it's just about having a good breath. Drop in, feel that relaxation, that detension in the elbows and in the knees and so on. And then you're more likely to drop in a bit more supple and a bit more confidently as you drop in. But those 3 pillars, they all work together. So it's going to be really hard to ride really effectively in a confident way when you were not applying the right methodology. And just going in a really long-winded way back to your kind of point, sometimes that will be riding a different trail every run. Yeah. Sometimes it will also be sessioning. Yeah. And so on. And actually that session mentality sometimes allows you, again, it goes back down to feedback loops. So as you session something, you get that instant feedback. If you then just go onto another trail every time, like that's always what you do, you never allow your brain and your body and muscle memory and so on to actually understand, okay, that didn't feel good, but why didn't it feel good? For this reason. Okay, what happens if I do this? And it's kind of like being a little bit of a scientist there, like, okay, what happens if I do this? What happens if I do, okay, that made, that really worked. That really, and that then solidifies learning for going forward. But if you only ever ride different trails every time, it offers less of that. So,
and as well, I think if we take Dan as an example, I may have quoted him wrong. He may not have said every single time. I suppose one thing from that is interesting is that I can possibly take away the wrong thing as well and then apply that to my riding. So that's quite interesting breaking it down because you take it as gospel.
Yeah.
As well, if you do break down that with him, so he's a pro rider at the absolute top of his game.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing here, but I suppose for him to get better at enduro, he needs to be able to ride new trails as fast as he possibly can. So maybe his limiting factor at the highest possible level is being able to ride a new trail at absolute race pace. So maybe for him, he does need to improve being able to go down a trail for the very first time and ride it at race pace. But for us mere mortals, we need to be able to corner properly and stay relaxed and jump and brake. And so, that makes sense, actually, I suppose.
And just to flip it on its head again, just not thinking about Dan, but just, anyone. Just, it's a really important distinction to make that different methodologies have different outcomes and kind of what you're wanting to achieve and so on. So sessioning, for example, helps, in like real simplified terms, it helps heighten your overall stance. Your overall speed. Okay. So by, or kind of performance or kind of skill, because you are rounding out and becoming better at that one thing, your absolute speed gets better.
Yeah.
The other method, i.e. going on doing lots of different tracks every time, allows you to ride as close to that absolute speed in more scenarios. So it's not to say one's better than the other. I'm definitely not saying that. And what I'm saying is we need a variety of both.
Okay.
So it's good to go out and do the sessioning because that'll increase your absolute speed. But it's also good to go out and ride different trails in every run to increase how close, or to shorten the gap between how close you can ride at, or as close to your absolute speed at a trail that you don't actually know.
Yeah.
You don't know exactly what's coming up around every corner.
Yeah.
Or like, even if it's a trail that you know. So I've been... I'd like to do some races this year again after a few years kind of hiatus. And so I'm now blending those two together. I'm trying to ride trails that I haven't ridden in a while and go out on rides where I do different trails on every run. But I'm also blending that with, on some rides, I go out and have a warm-up, cool down and so on. But in the middle, I ride the same trail 4 or 5 times to increase my absolute.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense. That's interesting. What races are you doing?
I don't know yet. It'll be some of the Welsh series, I'd imagine.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I used to race more often than not, or quite often back in the day. And I didn't like getting tied into series because I then go, it's quite expensive to race, isn't it? And it's a big weekend and I've got, kids and it's a big family commitment. And so I'm more like picking the races that I like the venue or the track. So I wouldn't go to a complete pedal fest, for example. But I'd like to go to ones that really challenge me, like Llangollen or places like that. I love steep tracks and that sort of stuff. So more technically orientated tracks, I guess.
Well, you just kind of, on that note then, you said obviously you've got 2 kids that keep you plenty busy enough, but you also want to improve your skills and your fitness.
Yeah.
How does somebody who is really time poor, who may only be able to ride once or twice a week, how do they maximize? Because I imagine we're kind of sat here talking about specifically improving, but then before any of that, you have to actually focus and have the intention on improving, don't you?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people just go out and ride, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But if somebody just goes out and rides twice a week, what would be the first steps for them to think, I want to improve? Just improve in general. What should they do first? And then to follow on from that, how do they maximize those 2 rides a week that they do have to improve? Because they probably don't want to spend one of those rides in a car park. Not that you would suggest they do that.
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, it's about understanding, well, what does success look like? You say one, but someone says improve. Well, what does that look like at the end of the day? Is it actually just being able to get around the course? Is it being able to improve on a result? Is it to just enjoy the weekend? What does success look like?
Yeah.
And from there, you can start to fill in the blanks a little bit, without having like a case study to kind of offer real kind of deep insight into. I'd say how I'd work with the client. I wouldn't necessarily go into it in kind of always talk about it in these very outwardly ways, but I'd be assessing some form of performance wheel. So where can we get the most bang for the buck? Yeah. What types of things? What does success look like? Where are you trying to be successful? So if, for example, somebody's trying to be successful in an enduro race, but they only train like a downhiller, well, there's a bit of a disconnect there, or vice versa. So if, for example, like I think that's probably quite common now, actually, that there's people get loads of trail bike time, but not necessarily as much downhill bike time. So if they're wanting to be, if success for them looks like performing really highly or performing a certain way at a downhill race, well, then there needs to be some sort of balance in their kind of training. And then it's about understanding, well, where are you going to see the biggest kind of reward? So if fitness, as an example, is your clients or a client is really struggling with fitness, well, actually, one of those, if they're riding twice a week, is kind of in this hypothetical scenario, hypothetical person, well, actually, maybe one of those rides needs to be more fitness orientated, and then the other one could be more kind of skills orientated. Again, without having that kind of case study, it's really just about being as well rounded as you can. I think. Especially, thinking about modern enduro nowadays, especially in the UK, we roughly know what to expect, especially if you've done a few races before. You roughly know, you're generally given a distance guide. So it's going to be 5 trails over at a national level, sort of 40-ish K, maybe, something like that, 35K, maybe 50K, it can be big. And we know it's going to, pretty much in the UK, it's going to be all pedal. You're not going to be getting a lift up to the top or anything. So we know there's quite a significant fitness requirement. So it's then about building that into your plan. How we work with clients, and something I commonly talk about, is this idea around training day rides versus match day rides. So within mountain biking, we are very, it's quite common to do what's known as what I call match day rides, where basically we get out of our van, or we drive to our venue, we get out of our van or car or whatever. You just sit on the bike, you think, yep, that's all right. And then you pedal off. There's no like real stretching or kind of anything going on. And then you ride up a hill, down a hill, up a hill, down a hill, up a hill, down a hill, 3 or 4 kind of runs. You think, oh, that was good. And then you end up back at your car, and you then sit back down and perhaps go to the pub and then kind of go home. That's a classic like match day ride, and they're really good. They're really important. I'm not saying don't do those at all, but if that's all we ever do, we miss out on what I call training day rides, which sounds a bit more formal and perhaps less fun or whatever. But I find that actually, and when people get into them, they're actually
fun,
really fun. Equally, if not more, because we create what I call the kind of yes factor, where you get that real dopamine hit when you
improve on something.
When you prove on something, you kind of give you that feedback loop. And what a training day ride, it's very much more kind of skills based and kind of technique focused sort of thing. And again, us being ALine being very sort of client centered, we don't have a fixed model of what a training day ride looks like, and that will look differently to all of our clients. Mm-hmm. And I often talk to people, what works for you? What constraints do you have? What parameters are you working within? And we can start to build up from there. And so for some, that looks like, say they've got 2 hours or an hour and a half. 2 hours is about my limit with a young family and work and blah, blah, blah. It will be, rather than designing a 2-hour loop, which would be a typical match day ride, I'd look at maybe designing an hour's loop, or an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half sort of loop, and spending that remaining time, so still going out for the 2 hours, but where I session something.
Yeah.
And then within that, become very technique focused and kind of behavioral focused rather than outcome focused. So like a really common thing when I'm out coaching, and sometimes talk about it with clients so they can kind of see it, especially in Grenoside Wood, it's really quite common that because it's quite, the laps, they're only like a minute and a half. People do multiple laps. What typically you'll find is we're session in a section, and another person, a general rider will come down and they'll ride, say, said corner at a given speed, and they'll go off and then we wait normally at 10, 15, 20 minutes. We're riding in the meantime. We're not just waiting for that person to come back. And
stood that shivering.
Yeah. Just hoping that they come back. And then 10, 15, 20 minutes or whatever later, you'll often see that same rider come back.
Yeah.
And they'll come through the same speed and the same technique. So if there was something that we noticed that was perhaps slightly off or whatever, could be a balance or posture type thing, or they're not optimizing other cornering techniques, for example, they'll come through with those same limiting factors and so on. And that isn't to poke judgment. It's got nothing to do with that. It's just to reinforce that on match day rides, we typically ride towards our limit and we just reinforce the actions we're doing.
Yeah.
On a training day ride, we add in this kind of more behavioral focused, where you're allowing that feedback loop and that kind of instant feedback loop. And then importantly, you're adding some time to correct or to change or to play with it and start to understand the wider picture. So I'd really encourage for someone who is wanting to perhaps, improve or, go back to the original question this year is just to think about, what does success look like? What would they like to achieve? But then also, what methods are they really employing to achieve that thing that they're trying to do? And then methods within methods as well. So like, are you working perhaps are you working on some fitness? Are you working on nutrition? Are you working on your skills and so on? And how round is your profile? And, some people, I go into this with loads of detail. Some people, it's just a simple sort of question. Rate your nutrition on 1 to 10.
Yeah.
Rate your, that's a really, really simple, like something your listeners can take away from it. Just, we call them rulers. So 1 to 10 rulers. Just rate yourself on a 1 to 10. And it's not an objective measure. You don't have to tell anyone or whatever. Yeah. There's no like someone, checking up on your numbers or whatever. But just give yourself an honest sort of appraisal of kind of where you think these things are.
Yeah.
And if your nutrition's a 5 out of 10, well, what does a 6 out of 10 look like? Don't try to do a 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
Because that's miles from where you have been. And I think I listened to one of your podcasts earlier in the year, and I think it was around January, and going hard in January for like the fitness side of things, but you've dropped off by February. Yeah. It's like, no, we're not saying that. We're saying, so what does a 6 out of 10 look like? Okay, so what feasibly, if you're currently doing a 5, and this is what a 6 you think looks like, well, what feasibly within that 6 could you do? Let's take small steps.
I think a lot of people struggle to do that as well, because I think people go through, let's say weight loss as an example. People want to lose weight for weeks and months and think about losing weight. And then when it comes to actually trying to lose the weight, they have a ton of motivation. So they want to go for a 10 out of 10. And it's really hard if someone's a 5 out of 10, like you've said, to get somebody to just do a 6 out of 10 when they're really motivated, because they want to do the 10 out of 10. What they don't see is often when they do that 10 out of 10 is that it's so hard to do a 10 out of 10 because, I mean, a 10 out of 10 nutrition, as an example, would be weighing absolutely every meal, logging every meal. I used to, when I was a PT in the first company that I worked sort of at, there was another PT who was a fitness model, a female fitness model. So she was competing on stage in a bikini, really, really fit, looked really like great. And she weighed out every single meal. And I remember once going to a restaurant with her, and she took a meal with them, gave it to the restaurant and asked them to microwave it for her and bring it out.
Wow.
So that's like a 10 out of 10 nutrition, which 99.9% of people, myself included, are just not going to want to do that.
Yeah.
So I think the big thing for a lot of people, like you said, is just trying to go from a 5 to a 6 or a 7, rather than trying to go to that absolute huge leap forward, which is just too much and is unsustainable.
Yeah, I just had to write some things on my phone there just to make sure I don't, because I think there's 2 things that kind of really stand out to me there. And it's something I don't know how often it's kind of talked about, but one is around, I think coaches really help. And I'm not just talking about ALine and, skills coaches, but being accountable. I think that really, really helps. So going back to my injury I kind of had last year, I got a fitness or a coach to kind of support me through my rehab. And one thing that helped massively was being accountable.
Yeah.
And that I knew that he was going to check on we'd have a weekly check-in or kind of bi-weekly check-in and so on. And I knew that he could see what I'd done. So I knew I needed to do my rehab, because if he'd ask why, and I'm paying all this money, I don't want to waste my money. There's no point doing that. So one thing I think coaches can really help with is being accountable. Yeah. I think that's a really, really helpful thing. And then just going back to your motivation thing, for all the people who like doing a bit of reading, you can look up a theory in psychology called self-determination theory. It's essentially, it's a theory of motivation. And kind of, I'm going to speak really kind of broadly and simplify the model here, because it does get a bit more complex. But essentially, it's trying to understand, how do we move from extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation? Because what we know from research is that for somebody to stick with something more long term, intrinsic motivation is way more powerful than extrinsic motivation. So in other words, in your example around weight loss, the extrinsic reward is seeing a certain number on the scales or whatever that might be. Typically, extrinsic rewards get less meaningful over time, or they're less consistent, and so on. And not to say that they're not important; they definitely are. That they really help when somebody's not motivated to do something. But finding how to become intrinsically motivated to secure behavior is way more powerful long term. And the model then goes into other ways you can do that around, like having autonomy and confidence and relatedness, or like doing with others and so on, that kind of help or influence that kind of relationship.
There was a reel, sorry to interrupt you, there was a reel on Instagram, saw last week, and I'm going to massacre exactly what it said, but I thought it was really interesting. And it was, it said the person who only wants to win the marathon, so the person who loves the idea of winning the marathon is going to be beat by the person who loves running.
Yeah.
And that's the exact same kind of thing, isn't it? Where like the vision of winning the marathon, but the person who just loves going out running every single day because they love doing the thing.
Yeah. And it's like, I know, I don't know these people at all, so I might be speaking out of turn, but people like, speaking in a mountain bike related sort of context, but people like Greg Minara and so on, and Steve Pete, and they've had such long careers. And I don't know if they had more of this sort of intrinsic motivation, but I would hazard a guess that they did. Yeah. In that it wasn't just about the reward. Yeah. It was about the doing. It was about the being there. It was more than just winning at the end of the day. I'm sure that was a big part of it, of course.
I can't imagine that your 14th win feels miles better than your 13th win.
Yeah, and it's really common, going well beyond mountain biking now, but across all sport, that you hear people talk about, Olympics is like a real classic one, because it's every 4 years. But they're really focused on that outcome going in 4 years' time, in these cycles. And there's only normally 2 to 3 times they can look to achieve this, because that's sort of 12 years, and they might be out of the window then. But then they get it, or they achieve it, and they're like, that wasn't quite as good as I thought it was going to be. And not to say that you can perhaps get rid of that, but it's going to have less of an impact on a person, perhaps well-being and so on. I'd imagine if there's if there's a lot of intrinsic motivation and so on built into that, as well as the extrinsic. If everything relies on the extrinsic reward, so like just relating it back to perhaps the listener base here a little bit more. If you go to put all your eggs in one basket at, say, Ardrock or Ardmores this year, or Norton, Northumbria, or something like that, and everything is about the result, then the race comes and goes, and you didn't quite achieve, for whatever reason, the kind of thing you might think, I don't know, that was awful. Like, I hated it. Like, you come away just on your drive home, like feeling awful. Whereas actually, it's because everything you've tied into that is all around an extrinsic outcome.
Yeah.
Something that's not in your realm of influence and so on. And so having extra, I'm not saying we shouldn't have extrinsic rewards. We definitely should, because they're the things that help motivate us in the winter to get on the bike trainer when it's cold and damp and so on. Thinking of them closer to the time and so on. As we go into it, if that's the only thing you've got, then it can be quite difficult. So having a balance is really key. So that's another good take home, I'd say, is think about why you want to achieve what you set out to achieve, and actually, if it's all outcome based, which tends to be what people kind of think of, what other things? What else do you want to get out of it that's more for you? Spending time with your mates, having that banter, perhaps grow a little bit in your mountain biking experience, riding a new place, that can be, part of it. And all these other sort of things.
I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about helping people improve the fitness on the bike, for me personally, I'm entering a couple of races this year and I feel very focused on that. But for me, it's about the impact it has on the rest of their lives as well. So one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about helping people get fitter on the bike is because to get fitter on the bike, you need to start training off the bike. And that involves going to the gym or training at home. And there's kind of loads of benefits to that. So let's just say you start training at home 2 days a week. When you're doing that, you start to tolerate pain, and you're putting up, when you're doing the press ups, you keep going through that hurts, that gets you stronger, which builds your confidence. And then it builds discipline. So if you say that you're going to do a bodyweight workout at 7 a.m. and you do it, you're building almost that discipline muscle. So there's kind of the training side of it. So it impacts your riding, but then it also makes you more confident. And then as well as that, you might say, right, I'm going to improve my nutrition because I want to feel better on the bike. And when you improve your nutrition, you do feel better on your bike. But then also your mental health starts feeling a bit better, and you're feeling more switched on and more awake, and you concentrate more. And it's kind of the broader impact. Like, very much my training and riding and eating well for me now is just a way of life. Like, I definitely don't eat anywhere near a 10 out of 10, but I'm focused on my nutrition every day. Like, I make sure I eat well every day. I can't wake up and have sugar puffs for breakfast, which for my American followers is a really sugary cereal, although I love them. And you can't eat pizza for lunch and then a ready meal because you just feel terrible. Like when we go to we tend to go to Disney in the summer, to Florida. Love it. Just like go, and the food in Disney specifically is nowhere near as well as at home. And you love it for 2 weeks, but after about a week, you're like, it's crazy the difference in my energy levels, like how sluggish I feel, how I just don't feel as sharp, like I'm not thinking as straight. Someone will ask me a question and you feel more dopey. And the difference is huge. So for me personally, kind of bringing that back to what you were saying about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, is that for me, the race is the extrinsic motivation. It's the goal. And I always make sure I have maybe like a financial goal that we're aiming for. So like yourself, we're renovating our house, which costs far more money than you ever realize until you start doing it. So you've got the extrinsic motivation there. But then the intrinsic motivation for me is that I just love doing all of those things and knowing that each one affects the different one. And I think that's what's so fascinating about it.
Yeah, it's cool.
That was a tangent for you.
Have you talking about Disneyland in Florida? Have you had churros there?
Yeah.
Oh, they're guilty pleasure there. Yeah, I could live off them.
Have you been before?
Yeah, a couple of times.
Like, have you really? To Florida, yeah. You don't meet too many people who've gone. I know Zach's been. We've chatted about it. Yeah. But yeah, no, we love it. We my family all used to go to Disney Florida, like my family being like my uncles and whatnot. And we never went when we were younger. We went to Disneyland Paris, and at the time I hated Disneyland Paris. So I think my parents thought I wouldn't like Florida. Right. But I'd always kind of wanted to go because they loved it. And then me and Sophie, when we got together 10 years ago, we'd been together about a year. We're this close to booking a holiday to Thailand. We're in the Trafford Centre. We're literally about to book it. And then Sophie did some Googling and found out that there were some riots or something in Thailand, or someone had been murdered on a beach or something like that. She's like, right, that's not safe. Can't go there. Yeah. So we're like, why don't we go to Florida? So we went, and then I think we've been 7 or 8 times then.
Oh,
Like we just
man.
absolutely love it. Like
Yeah.
live to go to to Florida. But yeah, no, we absolutely
You
love
have
it.
to start a Florida podcast as well.
No,
I think a
could
lot of
hold
people
my own
do.
on that.
Yeah.
Dude, we've been to like most restaurants and most of the hotels there and stuff.
Yeah. I've seen YouTubers that's their living, is like they go around rating it and talking about it and stuff.
And they have huge followings, way bigger than mine. They have like millions of views and whatnot. Yeah, it's big. I think things, because it's so big there, so large. If you've not been to Disney Florida, you don't know how big it is, do you?
Yeah, it's massive. It's like a city in it, or like a region, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's ginormous.
Yeah.
Boring anybody to death now who doesn't go to Florida.
Yeah.
No, it was me who started it. You talk about minimizing risk, which we've talked about before. I think that there's a common misconception that pro riders don't have fear. They're not worried about anything. They'll just send 10-story drops and just without a care in the doubt. You see the people who do Rampage. But I think the more people that I speak to, like we had Jack Redding, who's a downhiller on, and he definitely still feels fear. Things make him nervous. It's just that his skill level is so far beyond what ours is. What are your views around that? If that was a well phrased enough question.
Around fear?
Yeah, around fear. And I think the misconception that the best riders in the world don't get scared. And that's what... There's a misconception, I think, from less skilled riders or less fast riders, whatever, that pro riders just take the head out and don't feel fear. And that's why they can go 50 mile an hour down a hill. But the more you speak to, I don't think that's actually true.
No, certainly not. I'd agree with that. I would take... It depends on how you define it, really. So, like, what is fear? Is do you think it's a psychological, or is it a feeling? Is it a sort of response? So, broadly speaking, we have two sort of ways of fear. You have kind of semantic and sort of cognitive sort of thoughts. So, are you having thoughts about things that could go wrong, and that's kind of creating fear, or is it semantic, which is like physical, so that's like sweaty palms and stuff. So me personally, I more suffer with semantic kind of fear, anxiety sort of thing. So I'll be dropping into, say, I remember years ago did a race at Llangollen for the Welsh, Llangollen, like try to get the pronunciations right, and it was in the woods track. And there wasn't a kind of conscious thoughts around fear, which, just for those who don't know, is a really, really steep track, like really steep. And there weren't many thoughts around fear, but my heart rate was really elevated and my palms. So that's how I'd kind of recognize that there was kind of fear. And fear is a natural emotion and feeling. And all these things that you kind of hear sometimes as little 1-second memes or whatever online about fear and this sort of thing, they're not true. They're those processes in our head are there to protect us and are there to keep us alive, and they're there to keep us safe and well-rounded and so on, so we don't go too far. The whole thing about taking the brain out, I also don't really think happens, in the sense that what they're really saying is, I believe, is that they've ticked off enough of the boxes and they feel reassured enough and their confidence bucket is full enough that when they're dropping into X race run as a professional World Cup racer or so on, they are not having to think about fear of, can I do X, Y, or Z? It's more that they've reassured themselves. And I'd put money, and I've worked in mountain biking and so on within the world of sport and exercise psychology, and so as a mental performance coach. And I know that some people at the kind of elite end of sport still talk about things that that we talk about, whether perhaps the exact sort of theme of what they're talking about is just slightly different. They're talking about time or kind of they're not thinking about perhaps like a jump. They're talking about how fast can I do that, or doing it at that speed sort of thing, and so on. They definitely still have it, and that's a good thing to have. If we didn't have it, I think there'd be a lot more injuries and so on. So
true,
it's a part of your brain just recognizing there is something here that is potentially a threat or a challenge. And it's about then how you process that and assimilate that to kind of action, really, about what do you want to do about it. I think where the elites have kind of come to is that they typically have done the things that they need to have done, so that as they're dropping into a run, they've got a healthy amount of fear and a healthy amount of nerves and so on. Because nerves they're often perceived as bad, and they've got the stigma around being bad, but they're not really. They're just a feeling to kind of take note of something.
They feel bad.
They can
they're
do,
useful.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And if they feel bad to the point where they
it's
really
a level,
feel bad,
it's
then perhaps we've entered into that threat threshold as opposed to that
too
challenge.
Far.
And a World Cup downhill racer, they're not going to tracks that are challenging them to the point where they're saying, "Can I get down?" It's more around the kind of that speed kind of relationship, attractive sort of relationship, and then it's just about how much risk are they willing to kind of put into that and so on. And they also want the outcome and so on. So that kind of fear relationship is more about how you process it, how you understand it, how you define it, and then also what you do go on and kind of do about it. But that whole thing about taking the brain out, I really don't think that as as us mere mortals kind of think of it. I don't think that's actually what happens. I think what actually happens, they've ticked enough of the boxes out that they can remove their head, so to speak,
because they just know that they're prepared,
because they've done good preparation. That's right. And for those, it's a big reason why I like working in psychology and so on, is that somebody just doesn't. It's not just a tick box. Once it's done, it's not done.
Yes.
You then have. You see it all the time. Like people have good seasons, bad seasons. They have, good race, stronger race, and less, a weaker race, and so on. And often that comes down to the psychology of it. What happened on the run up to that? What happened in their wider life context? What happened on the morning or the day? Is it the type of track conditions? Have they done well there in the past? All these types of things kind of will influence their kind of perception of kind of what they're about to do, and therefore how much fear or not that they potentially have. But this whole conception around elite riders or elite athletes don't have fear is misplaced. I don't think that's quite right.
I think on that note, as you think about it more, you start to notice that actually pro riders do feel that fear. And you only notice it very subtly if you watch Red Bull Hardline and you'll see interviews. They always talk about they were really scared to hit that first one.
Yeah.
And I was watching Ollie Wilkins and Brendan Fairclough, one of their YouTube videos. And I think Brendan Fairclough had sent this canyon gap in his local woods. It was huge.
Little canyon gap.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he took Ollie to ride it, and Ollie was saying he was scared, and you can see looking at him, he was scared. He was excited as well. He knew he could do it, but it was interesting thinking, they can do that, and they're scared. It's just what scares them is a much higher level. You mentioned before about defining that feeling though, because nerves and excitement elicit a very similar physiological response. Yeah. And I remember at the Olympics a few years ago, it wasn't me who noticed this, but in all the interviews after the athlete had completed whatever sport they were doing, the interviewer asked the athlete, were you scared or were you nervous? And every single one said, no, I was just excited. And what's interesting is they're feeling the exact same physiological response to nerves, but they just labeled it in their head as I'm excited rather than nervous. So they literally feel the same feelings that we would feel before doing something. Yeah. We'd label it as nerves, and then you might start to go down the rabbit hole of I'm nervous, I'm going to tense up, I'm not going to do that great. They see it as, no, I'm excited, and it's going to help me perform because it's switching my brain on and my heart's pumping faster and it's pumping blood to the muscles. And I think that's really interesting. On that note, how important is the language that you use? Because I've noticed you picked me up a couple of times when I said always before. Didn't even notice that I said it, but you picked me up on it. How important is the language that you use for your performance?
Huge, I'd say. I often talk about, and it may sound a bit la-di-da to some people, but, the relationship you have with yourself. And the brain picks up on the language that we use, and it takes it quite literally. So if you're using things like, I hate this, like say you're going to a venue that you know is steep in tech, for example, and you had a bad experience there, and you're like, I don't like that venue. Instantly, your brain's picked up on that and said, right, Gareth said he doesn't like that venue. We're going to that venue. Or do you instantly my heart rate's going to start going up and I'm going to start to feel nerves. And I've started to associate that. So I think that the language that we use is kind of really important. And with going back to kind of practice in psychology and so on, I think it's really important to note that you hear lots of like tidbits and so on online. I think that they're great, but there's a deep body of like, well, what do we do about that, and how do we go about changing that?
Yeah,
that isn't quick and easy. And so us saying in this podcast, for example, that language is really important, and that we shouldn't be saying, so rephrasing is like a really common thing. So you normally go, first of all, become awareness of certain things that you might say. So that's kind of really key through like thought diaries and all different types of methods. There's more than just that.
What's a thought diary?
So there's things like it could be before or after a race, or any of it. It can be at any time. People can do them in days. You essentially just write down your thoughts about a subject, or it can be broad. Again, it's really person specific on kind of what they would like to achieve and so on. But you'd be amazed at how much you'll start to realize about your thoughts and about yourself when you start to write things down.
Yeah.
So that can be a really helpful tool. And then once you start to become aware of things, you can then start to address them. How do we go about that? So us saying in this podcast, language is really important. But how do we go about changing that? It's not as easy as just saying, well, stop saying those not bad things, and actually saying like a good thing, and rephrasing. And rephrasing is really challenging. And actually, it's not an easy thing. And it takes discipline, it takes time, and so on. And we work with people on these different kind of avenues to kind of slowly kind of restructure that, really. But yeah, the language that we use to describe scenarios, outcomes, behaviors, and so on is really important, because your brain takes that quite literally, and can often have quite a semantic response to that thought.
I'm definitely guilty of saying I can't jump. Because it's the same thing as if we go back to when I started riding those steep technical trails. At the time, I couldn't ride those steep technical trails. In reality, I'd just not gone to that many steep technical trails before, so I was telling myself that I couldn't. But I still do it now, where I say I can't jump, and it's simply because I don't actually go to places where you can jump, where there are jump trails, because there are none nearby. So I've never taken the time to teach myself. And I've noticed, I did it with wheeling. I used to always tell myself I can't wheelie. And that's something that obviously you can practice. So, 6-12 months ago, I could do a pedal wheelie. I can get up any obstacle by doing a little pedal wheelie, but that's very different to wheeling 100 meters down the road. I always used to tell myself, I can't wheelie, I can't wheelie, I can't wheelie. So you never even try. You'll do a little bit and be like, well, yeah, I can't wheelie. So obviously that didn't work. And I just challenged that and started to practice wheeling, and was thinking, well, there's no reason I can't do it. I've just not taught myself to. And the difference over the last, say, 12 months of how my wheeling's got is miles better, because you'll just be on a slight incline, a really boring climb. You just spend 10 minutes practicing your wheelie. The difference is huge. And it's gone from I can't wheelie to, I'm getting better at that, and then improving my wheeling. And you almost like, by saying you can't do something, you just cap yourself, and you literally put a cap, and as soon as you put that cap on, you can't get through that, because you just stop yourself before you even try to do that. And even just, it's not about thinking, I'm going to be able to wheelie for a kilometre. Just taking that can't off and using that different language, for me, allowed myself to just start practicing, and then you improve, because you're not automatically telling yourself you can't do it before you've even tried.
So that's a definition in research called fixed versus growth mindsets. And so a fixed mindset has an absolute, like I can't do something or whatever. And it's like, how do we slowly start to restructure that to be more of a growth mindset? I can't do that yet, or I can't do that because of, or I'm less skilled at that because of X, but I'd like to do this through. But it just changes it, and instantly again, that semantic response to that. So if you said I can't jump, and we went out for a ride, and I took you to some jumps, you'd be like, I can't do that. I feel really nervous, or I feel a bit crap about myself because you're showing me that I can't do. Whereas you say, if your mindset to it is, I do struggle with jumps a bit, but I'd like to improve. And I think I know how to start that journey. Then when I took you to jumps, you might be like, oh, well, can't do those, or I'm struggling with those ones, but maybe that one over there is all right. yeah, maybe I'll try that one. And all of a sudden it's a bit more open to it. And also as you're going there, you're probably in a bit of better psychology as you go into that scenario, because you're more comfortable, and you haven't told yourself you can't do something or you can do something. Again, it's way harder to do in reality.
Yeah.
And it takes discipline and time and various tools that kind of to support that. But yeah.
I'm a big believer in kind of your mental diet. And what I mean by that is just the information that you take in on a daily basis. And I think if we take the news as an example, with everything with Russia now, so the media, not to get political, but the media will latch onto any kind of sentence that somebody says to promote fear. So a good example in the last kind of week was the news story that conscription would be introduced if we were to go to war with Russia. Now, in reality, I think the actual part of that story as if we were to go to war with Russia, in other words, if there was World War III, then your everyday person would have to fight, of course, because it's a world war. We're all going to be fighting. But then that gets taken into a story, and the headline is conscription to be introduced in the UK, and everybody loses their heads. I think it's important to pay attention to what's happening in the world, but I find myself, if I do read the news too much, watch the news too much, in COVID, it was the same when it was just fear all around you.
Flooded, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, flood is a good word. Is if you don't sort of just do 20 minutes a day, and if you're doing 6 hours a day, if you're listening to the news in your car, and then you put it on the TV, and you go on news websites on your phone, and you read a newspaper, and then you watch the 10 p.m. That's like you say, a flood of kind of negativity. I personally think that's huge for your mental health for one, but then for performance as well, just to keep yourself in a sort of positive mental headspace.
Yeah.
Is that something that you agree with, have opinions on?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. If you're just trying to relate that back to a mountain bike sort of example, social media and Instagram and scrolling and people looking at, typically we follow, you follow your friends and stuff, but typically people also follow elites.
Yeah.
You think, oh, miles away from that.
Yeah.
Or gosh, they're good. Or gosh, you know, they're in this lovely like setting and so on. Like so often, like, oh, I'm not doing that. You can quite easily get yourself into a sort of negative kind of spiral. So I definitely kind of agree that. I think going back to another, hopefully you're kind of seeing a theme that kind of throughout the podcast is around awareness. And I think it's just about reflecting back and asking yourself, well, where, you know, become aware of what's healthy, what's not healthy, and defining that yourself a little bit. Because sometimes social media is actually, so again, I don't actually think social media as a platform is a bad thing.
Yeah.
But how humans have then started to interact with that platform and digest that platform is in, not all, but you know, many examples become not necessarily healthy. And healthy is obviously a spectrum, it's not binary. And so understanding how, is that healthy for you full stop? I mean, you do hear in sometimes people completely remove themselves from it. And in the elite example, you know, that they subscribe to an agency who does their social media, for example, or something, and that might be just because it is just a negative influence in their life, and or so on. I haven't got any examples there, but you know, it's that sort of thing. Or if it is generally, or can be a good thing, you know, it can. Sometimes I see something, or I very much limit. I think I'm allowed allowed. I've set my limit on mine for 20 minutes a day.
Oh, it literally stops you.
Yeah. So that's cool. 20 minutes, and most of that's work.
Yeah.
Doing like social media posts and so on. But I will go through every once in a while and just see what people are up to. And I see something, like that style looks really good. I'd like to mimic, and that really influences me positively on my next ride. Yeah. And I think, I'll try to add a bit more style in here, or I think I'm trying to get my whips better, on a jump. Right. Oh, they're doing that. I kind of really break it down. I'm like, okay, I think my hips aren't moving quite early enough, or I'm not getting quite enough counter steer on the lip or something. So I'll try to introduce it. So it can be a really positive thing. Yeah. So I think it's about understanding and having that awareness around, what is it healthy for you? Yeah. What are you using it for? And then also looking more broadly, like, is it taken away from home life, family life, all that sort of stuff? Because the one thing that social media feeds into, as an example, is, again, that dopamine response. It instantly gives you that hit. Yeah, on every scroll. And that's kind of what we get stuck on and kind of hooked on into. But there are other ways to do that as well. So yeah, I think media can be good, can also be negative, and it's about having that awareness and that kind of honesty with yourself. Again, that relationship with yourself to where's good, where's that line, and where do you draw it, and what does that look like?
Yeah.
And that will change throughout the season. So like you'll see people, athletes, for example, they're more likely to come off these things kind of in the summer. I don't want to know that somebody's doing really good at the minute or really loving their life or whatever. Yeah. Or sometimes people use it as a bit of propaganda. I've heard, not actually in mountain biking, but in other sports, I say, where they, not propaganda, that's the wrong word, sorry. They use it as,
what you're getting at, though.
They try to portray that actually everything's okay.
Yeah, in reality,
actually it's not, because they've picked up an injury that they don't want anyone to know about.
Yeah,
and
that's
that
interesting.
Sort of thing. And it's not a big injury, so like they don't need to tell the world, but they've got a small break in their wrist or whatever, and actually they need a month off. And, but they don't want the world to know that, or sponsors to know that, and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So, but as a person digesting that, as I don't know the person, I might just be thinking they're having the best time in the world. And so it's just about having that relationship with yourself and understanding it and just trying to figure out what works for you really.
I think the hard thing with social media as well, outside of limiting your time, because I think 20 minutes a day is great. If you're just spending 20 minutes, even if it's 20 minutes scrolling, whether it's positive or negative, that's going to have a limited effect anyway. I think if you're scrolling for 3 hours a day, there's never going to be a positive outcome from that. But I think one of the sort of the dangerous things about social media is you can't choose what you follow. So you follow people, but if you notice when you scroll through your Instagram, look how often it says suggested post. Every fourth post will be a suggested post from somebody that you don't follow, especially if you keep scrolling for a while. And what that means is that post that other people find interesting will then be pushed to you. That's one thing that I kind of find. I would love to just be able to control my Instagram and my Facebook where it only shows me content from people that I follow, because I really genuinely do only follow positive people and business people who put out interesting content and sports people. But then you see all sorts of other stuff that gets pushed to you, and that's where it's negative. And the thing is that if it knows what you want to look at, so it'll show you something. So obviously Sophie's Instagram recommended posts are totally different to what mine are. It knows what you stop and what you look at. So if you want to lose weight and you're feeling self-conscious at the minute, you might stop on a video that's talking about weight loss, and then you'll notice that the third post down is another weight loss one, and you look at that, and then it'll keep showing you stuff. Now, that's good if it shows you a load of positive weight loss stuff, showing you how to lose weight, but it can also go to the other extreme. And, there's examples of teenagers being shown a load of like anorexic content, and then it keeps showing them more and more and more and more. That's where it can be bad. That got off on a tangent there, but I think the one thing that I have picked up on that you said over and over and over again today is that awareness. And I think that'd be a great thing for people to take from this podcast, is just the awareness of your riding. What areas can you improve? Where are your weaknesses? What you're avoiding? All of that. I think if you're just aware of everything that you're doing, that sounds like it's the best first step people can take to improve.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah, awareness is key, because you can't trying to think of the right word. You can't fix or improve an area without first of all being aware of A, that it needs improvement, or B, that how to do that necessarily.
Yeah, definitely.
It's always the first step.
Well, I think that rounds off the podcast nicely. Thank you so much for coming on. There'll be links underneath there to link to ALine, so people can get in touch with you if they're in the area or within driving distance and get some coaching. But I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. So cheers. Appreciate it.